and welcome back to another episode of Beyond the To-Do List, a podcast about productivity. I'm your host, Eric Fisher, and in this episode, I'm excited to welcome Tyler Moore, also known as Tidy Dad, to talk about his new book, Tidy Up Your Life, Rethinking How to Organize, Declutter, and make space for what matters. In this conversation, we talk about the birth of Tidy Dad, how he came to be known as that, as well as the two split sections of the book where it's all about organizing as a mental process as well as a physical process. And no, we're not just talking about minimalism and just reducing for the sake of reducing, but we're talking about creating a balance and creating space for what really matters. We also talk about breaking overwhelming projects into smaller steps and some insights into how he and his family have collaborated to maintain an organized and functional living space, and how they decided to do that from a principles-first approach at home. So if you want permission to not feel like you have to have it all together organizationally, both in your space as well as in your head, but want to make progress in both those areas, you're going to love this conversation with Tyler Moore. Well, this week, it is my privilege to welcome to the show Tyler Moore, Tidy Dad. Tyler, welcome to Beyond the To-Do List.
Thanks for having me, Eric. And I always love when I have the two names now, that there's like my normal name of Tyler Moore, but then there's the like superhero-esque, like Tidy Dad is here. So that intro, that's great.
Yeah. And I don't know if anybody's called this out for you, but I'm a language nerd and I noticed the semi-alliteration going on where it's Tyler Moore, Tidy Dad. It's the same amount of syllables.
I know it's like this anthem or cheer, but it's funny because the name came actually because when I first started my Instagram account years ago, it was More Living, which was like a play on my last name. And I thought, oh, that sounds really nice. It's sort of this like sort of holistic approach to life. But then a few months in, I had this friend that does marketing and he was working for Spotify. And he was like, you always use the hashtag Tidy Dad. He was like, have you thought about changing your name? He was like, there really is something to that like from a branding standpoint, you want something where when someone reads it, that like they automatically can sort of assume what that brand is going to represent. So like with the name Tidy Dad, like there aren't many dads out there doing what you're doing. And like it sort of invites people to ask questions and linger a little bit, which is what you want. And so we were on a bus. It was like my first ever dad trip. I had two young kids and I was like, okay, let me just change it right now. And so I changed it and then went through the whole day skiing. And then my wife was like, did you just change your Instagram name? And I was like, yeah, Tidy Dad sounds great, doesn't it? And she was like, okay, but you didn't even like talk to me about it. So at first it was a little bit like, what is this? But it's been cool.
So Tidy Dad forgot to consult with Consulting Mom.
Yeah, it was funny because I was like, well, you can change your name to Tidy Mom. I was like, we'll have Tidy Dad and Tidy Mom, but Tidy Mom was already taken. But Tidy Mom is like a food blogger that hasn't posted basically since like 2013. So we couldn't take the Tidy Mom name. So Tidy Dad is here.
Okay, well, I gotta ask, like, how is this all coming about? Like, you clearly on this journey had some point where you thought you wanted to move into more living, Moore, living. Although, again, your friend was right. Like, people,
I know
it's just not verbally. Like, if I said, hey, go check out More Living, you'd have people typing in More living, and they just wouldn't find you. And so... But
no.
How did this journey start for you of the tidying up your life? The book is called Tidy Up Your Life, Rethinking How to Organize, Declutter, and Make Space for What Matters. The book is obviously coming after you doing this for a long time, but what was that kind of first step where you're like, I need a tidier life? And what does that even mean? Like, obviously a lot of thought went into this.
Mm-hmm. And you know, there are certain seasons of life where you feel like you're just holding everything together. And then there can be that one sort of moment that is like it's sort of like that camel that breaks, or it's the straw that breaks the camel's back, you know, that like metaphor. Right. And for me, it was after the birth of our second daughter that I feel like, My wife is a pediatric occupational therapist. I'm a teacher. We had our one daughter, and it was like, wow, we're going to be great at this. Like, we've read all the books. We have the space in our tiny apartment. That's when I decided, like, I'm going to move from teaching into school administration. So as we were upsizing the number of people that lived in our apartment, I was also upsizing positional responsibilities, my career, sort of the expectations that people had of me. I was checking off all of those boxes of like what you are expected to do. I was in my early 30s at the time, and I was successful by a lot of people's standards. But yet I found that when our second daughter was born, my mental, emotional, and physical capacity of what I was able to handle was completely taken over by the responsibilities at home, the responsibilities at school. And I had these series of moments where I was like, I don't know where life is headed right now. I felt huge waves of anxiety, feeling overwhelmed. And I feel like, for listeners, we all have those sort of moments in life where things happen, where it's like, I should be so happy right now. Like everything is going well for me, but yet you sort of have these lingering doubts. And so Tidy Dad was sort of birthed from a my mental health crisis. I had to take leave from my job. I was 2 days home into leave and decided that, in this tiny apartment we're in, like, why don't I just flip bedrooms with our daughters? My wife was like, I don't know that you need to take on that project today. Like, that might be a good project, but please don't do it. And so she left with our daughters later that afternoon. And I thought, if I can just prove to her that this is a good idea, like, seeing is believing. So that's when I switched stuff, imploded the apartment, and then set out on this like 6 to 9 month journey to tidy up our space, and then in turn sort of tidy up my life. When it was born from a huge implosion of mess, but sometimes things have to get worse before they get better.
I love that it's tied in to the stuff and the disorganization and organization need, sensing a need of organizing of stuff being tied to internal thought, and the feeling of that being a symbol or a status or a state of being of our internal conflict with our own disorganized thoughts and feelings and inadequacies and all of that, that it's not just about the stuff. Sometimes it's kind of why I enjoy, like, even just the other day, I pulled out Tetris and played it and felt like putting the boxes in the bricks in the right order, putting them in the order gave me the sense of accomplishment of checking things off a to-do list. And I love that that's tied together. I also kind of hate that it's tied together in a way, right?
Yeah, because even with the game of Tetris, like, you feel like for a certain point of time, you pass all the levels because everything gets in just right. But then the speed starts to pick up in intensity, and the blocks are coming down faster than you can put them in play. And then suddenly the game is over and you lose. But then you're like, oh my gosh, like, if only I had done this, or if I'd better paid attention to this. But what's cool also about Tetris and with life is that, like, you do get an opportunity to sort of do it over again. Like, you can never go back to that initial starting point. But like, even when you start that next game of Tetris, like, it's not like the first time you played Tetris. You have a better sense of, like, when is the speed going to increase? What do I need to visually sort of do to flip these blocks so that they can fit into place? What's going to be my new strategy? And I think that that's what my journey has taught me, is that it's not like you just tidy things up and then there's not a mess ever again. Like, that isn't realistic. That's not life. And so I love that analogy of Tetris, because that is what life is, that sometimes we have these things that are coming at us so quickly, and it's, how are we going to manipulate or move or shift in order to make things fit together?
Yeah. The other thing I want to point out is, and I think you already know this, but listeners might not, is that the book is divided into two parts, where it's the first part is tidying up your mind, and then the second part is tidying up your space, your stuff. And so it's that mental and internal, and then it's that outward and exterior environmental, the environment you live in, so to speak, your habitat. I act like we're
Yeah.
animals. But anyways.
No, I agree with you. And, with Tidy Up Your Mind, there are so many different facets to being able to make sense of the mental mess that we're in. And like part of my journey is that I was in therapy for 3 years. My wife and I started at couples therapy, and I quickly thought that the therapist really enjoyed my stories better than my wife's stories, because at one point she stopped us mid-session and she was like, Tyler, I really think that you would benefit from individual therapy sessions. And we left the session. We were walking down the sidewalk and I would turn to my wife, Emily, and I was like, Suzanne really enjoys my stories. Did you hear her say that she wants me to come to individual sessions? What do you think that means? And my wife was like, you're the one with the mess. You're the one that needs to sort this out. But I do feel like therapy taught me a lot, but we all have different ways of thinking. It doesn't mean that something's necessarily wrong with us, but I do feel like sometimes you need somebody who's sort of impartial, who's helping to either repeat back or pull out the trends or themes to what it is that we're bringing up. And so for my journey with tidying up my mind, the gift of therapy was really revolutionary. But as a man, especially coming from my very Southern conservative background, nobody went to therapy. And when I told my parents that I was going, there was this oh my gosh, what's wrong? And so I had to explain to them therapy's not necessarily a bad thing. These are some of the things that I'm working on. And then they were like, do you only talk about us in therapy? And I was like, Mom, Dad, no. I have my own stuff to deal with. And so it was interesting, that tidy up your mind piece. I feel like that so often manifests itself in mental or emotional or also physical clutter. And that was true for my own story. And I'm finding that with readers, that's the exact same, but it's something that they resonate with.
Yeah. And it's important. You even call it this. It's like unpacking your mess, or identifying and unpacking what your mess is. And I really enjoy that. And I think the other thing, this being a productivity show, a lot of people struggle internally with mess and how much they can do or how much they should do even. It's that enough concept that you talk about. Unpack that enough concept a little bit for us.
Yeah. So just enough is this idea that, it was born from the question of people were like, so are you just minimalists? Are you trying to live within this extremely low number of objects? And for us, it's the reality is no. We have 3 small kids, we're in 750 square feet, but this idea of just enough is, am I able to edit down certain categories in order to create space for those things that do matter? And so just enough could relate to I love to do triathlons in the summertime. So I need swim gear, I need running gear, I need stuff for cycling. In order to make space for those things, you can't upsize all areas of life and think that you're going to have enough space to go around. So with just enough, I think it's being able to name what matters. It's what's rooted in your core values, that it's if your values are around family or choice time, or being able to pursue hobbies or have space for friends, or being able to collect things, or feel your work life is manageable in that you're able to enjoy time outside of work. You are going to have to edit certain categories of things in order to make space for what really matters to you.
That makes sense. And I think that's the thing, is that just even knowing the different hats that you wear. We talk about this a lot, where it's I've got one, you've got a teacher hat, so to speak. Yeah. You've got a father hat, a husband hat, a sibling hat if you have siblings. You've got a son hat for your parents, and there's more. And just a caretaker of the home. It's we always are we want to optimize things. People that are into productivity, they're talking about, I want to get enough done. And by being able to define what that enough is, especially when it comes to digital work that can't really clearly sometimes be defined by physical space, tidying up sometimes often has to do with physical space, where you're tidying up the room's clean for now, but how do we keep it that way? Or how clean is clean enough? Or how tidy is enough? How organized is enough? If that stray paper sitting there on the dining room table, is somebody going to explode? Like those kinds of boundaries and expectations and agreements even, because I'm sure there was some of this where it was like, you said earlier, seeing is believing. I'm sure maybe you and your wife had even disagreements about what enough was.
Absolutely. And, through those negotiations and us being able to together sort of set boundaries first around physical objects that then invited us to reflect on other more inanimate objects like time or our professions or work, that it was like we were able to hone our decision-making abilities, because like the number of blue plaid shirts that I had, it actually doesn't have that huge consequential impact on life. But if you can begin to, in a granular way, say, I really like the fit of this shirt, or I really like from the plaid shirt, the light blue with the dark blue plaid, as opposed to like the dark blue with the red. If you can hone those decision-making abilities about something like shirts, you can then begin to transfer it into other areas of life. And for a long time, going back to work and what you were talking about with productivity, I thought like the way to get better at work, or the way for things to be less overwhelming, was just to throw more time at it. That I thought, okay, I'm not getting, especially when I was a school administrator, I was like, so much of my day is reactive. Like I'm at the whim of teachers and students and parents. And at like any given point in time, somebody was mad at me. There was a problem to solve, but that meant that I wasn't getting to email. I wasn't reviewing lesson plans. I wasn't setting up observations with teachers. So my thought was, okay, well, if I now just start to schedule more time on Saturdays where I'm working, like if I can work all day Saturday, then I can catch up on that stuff for the week ahead. But that meant that responsibilities within the home weren't balanced. I wasn't spending time with my children. I wasn't talking to my wife about the work that she was balancing both inside and outside of the home. And so it's fascinating when you just try to work harder at something. You think that that's like from a productivity standpoint going to get you where you need to be. But I have found that just created even more of a mess.
Once you create that precedent, when things get out of whack enough, I'm going to have to pick up a Saturday where I leave home, go into the office, and I just catch up. We always have this running mental list of things that need to be caught up on instead of redefining what normal is.
I think that's key, because, when I went back into the classroom, my like litmus sort of test of did I need to tidy up even more was this idea of the Sunday scaries, because for so long I had the Sunday scaries, which was sort of this like looming feeling of like, oh my gosh, Monday is coming around again. And then the Sunday scaries sort of turned into those Saturday blues. And then the Saturday blues transitioned into this like Friday frenzy, where it was like I was anticipating all of this anxiety that was going to come. So when I went back into the classroom, I really had to think about how I was going to not fall into those traps again. And it was like, how can I name for myself what are those big important rocks? Like, what are the non-negotiables this week that have to be done? Then there was like my nice to get to list, or like my later list of like, maybe this will be there. I also had to work on like balancing out my prep schedules, figuring out where were my huge rocks of time. But I actually found that from a productivity standpoint, when I started to envision the week as a whole and then start to fill in what those rocks were, that helped me to better prioritize, as opposed to just sort of being much more reactive and like waiting for things to happen before I then set about my like plan for work.
Yeah. And we've talked about this before. I mean, you've probably heard about that. You put the big rocks in and then the next ones and so on, because if you just put the small ones in first, then nothing else fits in there. I've seen it demonstrated physically in front of me before, and it just made such an impact. Of course, then holding on to that and having recalibration, let's call it, occasionally. In fact, right now, for me, that's actually something that needs to happen. And I would encourage anybody listening. Yeah. I'll find the YouTube link to the video and include it in the show notes for this episode. People can go and watch literally the physical manifestation of putting in the big rocks first, then the next one, this next smaller level, then the next smaller level, and they all fit in. Whereas doing it the opposite way around and pouring like water into it, nothing fits if you do it the wrong way. So
yeah, we talked earlier, like I went on the Today Show today, and it's funny the things that you like become sort of known for, that it's like in all of my life's work, like this is what an audience is going to remember me for. But I was talking about my weekday cleaning routine, and I took that idea of marathon cleaning that used to happen on Saturdays. Before I had kids, it was my cathartic time. I could listen to a podcast, listen to music, and for a couple hours, clean our entire apartment. But once we had children, that no longer worked because I was cleaning at the same time that my walking tornadoes were making messes. So I decided, what could I do with this? And so I took that overwhelming task of marathon cleaning and divided it across days of the week. That we're in a small apartment. We have 5 rooms in our apartment. So I clean the bathroom on Monday, the kitchen on Tuesday, the living room on Wednesday, bedrooms on Thursday, and the playroom on Friday. But when it came time for me to actually write my book, my agents were like, do you think that you can get this work done? And I was like, I think that I can. I'm going to adopt my weekday cleaning routine to writing an entire book manuscript. And I was like, I know the starting date and I know the ending date, but let me put these lines in the sand. Let me figure out what are these big rocks that need to be in place. Let me look at my school year calendar, because I'm always motivated by school breaks. And I'm motivated in that, I don't want to work on school breaks, and I am willing to do whatever I have to do up until that break to get stuff done. So that's where I put in my big deadlines. I put in my big deadlines before Thanksgiving break, before the winter break, before our February recess, before spring break, because I knew that that was motivating to me. And from a productivity standpoint, that was going to help. That's very different from my wife. And I remember her asking and saying, do you really want to push yourself this hard up until break? And I was like, yes, because what I know about myself is I'm then subconsciously know that I have this clear sort of line in the sand time where I'm going to be able to sit back and rest. And so I do feel like productivity and tidying, I do believe that you name it, sort of you can tidy it. And I do think that it's what you're talking about, of if you can name that big sort of project, that big task, that thing that may feel overwhelming, but then sort of determine how do you break it up into manageable parts for you, that is really where there can be that productivity power.
You mentioned 3 little tornadoes. How has this whole process and journey affected your relationship with them? And even how have you involved them or given them some of your experience of this in terms of, I don't want to say pressuring them to do what they need to, but what's the dialogue been with them?
It's fascinating that my daughters have given me a different sort of moniker, which is messy dad, that they like to, when they're at their moment of oh, dad, really, why? They like to throw out that little messy dad line. But for us, there are some things that are really important that are sort of like what we were mentioning about these big rocks, or even non-negotiables. And for our family, this idea of weekend adventures are huge, that I love knowing that Saturdays are sort of open-ended for us to be able to enjoy the city that we're in. We're in New York City. We also have a cottage in Pennsylvania. So it's if we want to retreat or get away to that space, if we want to be able to go to museums or shows or explore, in order for that to be able to happen, then there are other routines that have to be in place during the week. And so we've had really frank conversations with them, especially as they've gotten older, of trying to explain the why behind things. And there are other decisions that we've made. My oldest daughter, a few months ago, we were walking down the sidewalk, and I always ask them sort of what do you want to do when you grow up? Where do you want to live? What choices do you want to make? Because I grew up in Kentucky. I chose a lifestyle that's as far removed from my upbringing as possible. So it's funny because I'm where are my daughters going to choose to go? Are they going to choose these McMansions in Texas? Like, is that the alternative to this small apartment living in New York City? But, she turned to me and she was like, Daddy, I think when I grow up, I might want to live in a small space too. She's like, and I'll probably drive an old car like us, because we drive a 2000 Chevy Malibu, because there's no car payment. The maintenance is little. It can fit into any spot around New York City, and I don't have to worry about it getting like nicked or dinged up because nobody wants my car. And she was like, because I want to be able to travel. I want to be able to do these adventures. And I was like, yeah, I mean, that's what we've chosen to do. But the beauty of life is that there are lots of choices. Like, you're going to get to decide what you want to do. But that's why we all fold laundry together. It's why we have these different routines and work that we take on as a family so that we can have that adventure space open up.
Your wife is also obviously involved with the home. How does her involvement or I mean, again, you as a family unit are doing things, but how is the marriage relationship accommodating this tidy dad ethos?
Yeah, it's funny because, the responsibilities that we take on, I feel like there are a lot of arbitrary sort of like gender norms within relationships sometimes, or there are these expectations of like, well, a certain spouse does this and then a certain spouse does that. And I feel like we've sort of flipped that on its head, that more so what we did years ago that was really helpful was we just made a list of the types of work that we actually enjoy doing. And it was like, let's just talk about work within the home that we enjoy. As a teacher, I very quickly was like, I enjoy tasks where I don't have to think. I was like, I will cook, I will clean, I will take care of laundry. All of that to me is sort of like passive thinking, because there's a clear sort of start and finish. I'm able to get it started. I'm able to execute it relatively well. And my wife was like, I'll handle the finances. She's like, I always enjoy sort of like crunching the numbers, looking at what things are going in, what things are going out. And I was like, great. But then we were both like, I hate mail. And I was like, okay, we both can't, like, you can't just decide that you both hate a task. Like, someone at some point, you either have to do it together or you sort of like divvy it up. But, we do have conversations around the types of work. We either share responsibilities, sometimes we outsource responsibilities, or we like eliminate the responsibility. And like for my wife and I, growing up, we both hated yard work, which is why we've chosen to live in New York City, because we don't have a yard to care for. As much as my daughters would like love a dog right now, like we're on a third floor walk up. I would have to take that dog in and out multiple times a day and down to the sidewalk, and then pick up with my hands everything that they do for their entire life. And so right now, that's just not work that I want to take on. So it is interesting when you think about work that you enjoy versus work that you don't, and then sort of look at that shared list and begin to divvy things up.
I love that you've thought about that in terms of the hiring out. I mean, it was probably not something super conscious when it came to the yard work stuff. You probably didn't think about it that way, but then you realized you'd made the decision subconsciously and then consciously were aware of it.
It's fascinating because, in New York City, it's a really transient sort of place. Like we've had, we have lots of friends move in and move out. We've lost many friends to the suburbs. And I say that somewhat jokingly because it's everyone's choice if they want to move to the suburbs. But I've had so many friends not consider the actual impact of like what it means to move to the suburbs, but remain at your same job, and where you once had a commute that was like 15 or 20 minutes. And now you have a commute that's like an hour and a half to 2 hours each day, each way, every single day of the week. And I often find that people lie about their commutes, that when you ask someone, so like, how long does it take you to get to work? Like they tell you the shortest time that it ever took them to get to work. And that's what they say is their sort of like normal day-to-day commute. And like a commute is work. And like right now, even this year, I moved to a new school because I was able to reduce my commute I had a walking commute, but it was 25 minutes each way. And now my new commute is 5 minutes each way.
Wow.
And like when you multiply out that time across the week, like that's huge. Like I always enjoyed the walking commute, but now I do feel like there's, 35 minutes. Well, I'm not doing the math well because it's late in the day, but 25 minutes, that's 50 minutes. If it's now 5 and 5, that's 10. So that's 40 minutes per day of additional time that I find in my day. And that begins to compound and multiply. And so it is sometimes those seemingly insignificant or small decisions, but it can actually have a huge impact on all other areas of your life.
And that's the thing I don't want us to get too stressed out about, is this idea that, oh my gosh, well, what are all those opportunities that I have? I'm sure there are many opportunities for small tweaks and decisions we can make, like that one, commute-wise, that can change things in terms of, okay, but the real question is, what are you going to do with that 40 minutes? Or do you miss that commute? Because I have been remote work for a while, for years and years, and I kind of miss I had a walking commute, and I kind of missed it. Yeah. After, I mean, it's been 10 years, I think, since I had a commute at all. And I think, I used to enjoy walking across a college campus to my office and stopping at the coffee shop or finding a different way and going into this building and that building, or discovering, ooh, there's that vending machine that only holds those certain things, or stopping by and saying hi to that coworker or friend in a different building. All those different options that I had, and just taking in the landscape. And, there's nothing stopping me, though, from then having those kinds of experiences intentionally in some other way. I just haven't thought to fill them in. But I want to go back to what my initial thought was. I don't want us to think about having to make all the decisions all at once. It's, sure, keep a running list. Like, maybe there's this option. Maybe, have a someday maybe list of possible decisions that you can tweak like that and become more organized. But don't get stressed out about just having too many. There's so many things you can do. There's so many changes you can make. I guess what I want to get at here is, like with you felt things were disorganized internally as well as externally. And for someone that's listening right now, what would you say would be some first steps with one or the other, but really it's both, of those things in terms of first steps?
Yeah, I think that question is key, because especially the time of year that we're in, we were talking about before we were recording, this idea of like, everybody is ready to declutter every single surface in their house. And it's like, they want to pull everything out, sort through it, and they think that magically, like, everything's going to go back to place, but that just doesn't happen. And I feel like with that idea of sort of like, where do you start? Like, I'll use the metaphor of like decluttering first, that like, with decluttering, I think if you're motivated, you need to declutter those items that you don't have to negotiate with anyone about. That it's like your physical clothing, the things that you wear. Nobody else wears your clothes. While yes, they may have preferences about what you wear or don't wear, like, you can ultimately decide what it is that you want to wear every single day. And so like, clothing is a category of things that you can just go through. Your work bag, like if you are leaving every single day, like, you're able to choose what is it that you actually need or want inside of that. And if you haven't gone through it in a while, that's something to sort of like sort and go through. I notice all your cute little like gadgets and things. It's like you have your own little like joy shelf behind you. Like, those are things that bring joy to you. You alone can name, like, I like this one, I don't really like this one, I want to sort of put this one away for a while, clear this off, but you don't have to negotiate with anyone. And so that's where I started my own sort of journey. Like, it was with my closet that once again then allowed me to layer on these other more complex decisions. Like, my decision to step back in my profession, my decision to step back from school administration to return to teaching, it didn't come right away. Like, it was months of thinking and wondering and pondering. And then there was that huge emotional step of like, am I actually going to go talk to my boss? And am I going to say, I want to return to the classroom. I want to give myself a sort of demotion. Like that took a lot of mental work and peeling back those layers. But I do think at first you have to think a little bit selfishly while also not putting yourself in a trap of needing to negotiate with someone else over the stuff that you want to start to go through.
It seems like, yeah, if you can identify, go for a space like I've got behind me, these couple shelves. Mm-hmm. Nobody else in my house, save maybe my son, who would want to, hey, if you're not going to hang that up, can I put it in my room, kind of a thing. But identify those places where you have agency. I always like to say we all have more agency than we think we do, but there are places where you have agency and no one else cares or is, like no one's going to speak to that. In other words, no one else's opinion really matters in that one area. Right. And I think that when you can begin to identify that, even when going back to the career for a second, for what you just said, is that no one should really have an opinion about this. Like when I measured my success based off of what I thought friends would think of me, of what family members would think of me, of like what my random Facebook friends would think of me. Like the people who were actually impacted were my daughters and my wife. Those were the stakeholders that really mattered. And so when I could identify like, who do these decisions matter for? Like, who am I actually impacting? What would be the impact if I didn't tidy things up? It wasn't on all those random people. It was my wife and my daughters. Those were the non-negotiables. And so I think that there is a lot of power in that you just mentioned of like, whose opinion actually does matter? Like, that's a deep question. It's a very important starting point right there. And I think that, sometimes we talk about this. Sometimes people throw this phrase around called quick wins. And that is one that you can have. And it kind of is a starting point towards what you were talking about earlier, where you would clean a certain room every given day. And so if you're just compartmentalizing and saying it's this one physical space that I have the control over and don't have to negotiate with anybody else on, and I feel like that's now, air quotes, under control for now, then I can move on and other things will appear.
Yeah. And it's funny because, even with that weekday cleaning routine that you were talking about, like I still set my 15-minute timer every morning. I've been cleaning one area of the house each weekday for over like 7 years right now. I don't actually need that timer because I sort of, intuitively know what the order is, what the sequence is. But every morning when I set that 15-minute timer, like it is my like productivity moment. I'm working efficiently. I'm able to see what I get done. But at this point, it like helps me to develop muscles then for other more complex tasks as I go throughout my day. But there is this feeling of sort of like success from the start, because it's normally around 5 a.m. that I'm cleaning one area of my house, apart from the bedrooms, because everyone is still sleeping. But it does feel like this win for me early in the morning that sort of like encourages me and motivates me to then take on what I know is going to be much more complex as I go throughout my day. That if I accomplish nothing else, like how many people can say that they've scrubbed their toilet at 5 a.m. on a Monday morning? Like really, it's just this guy, but that makes me feel a little bit better.
I think most people right now are saying that's not me, but I'm okay with it being you.
And it might teach you something, so no, I don't think that everyone has to do it. I feel like the bigger productivity message really is just, can you identify what's overwhelming you right now? Like if you can concretely name sort of what those areas of your life are, can you then begin to consider how to break it down into more manageable, like bite-sized parts? And I think that is the power of tidying up your life, is being able to name what matters and then figure out what are the steps that you put in place in order to make whatever it is that's important to you actually happen.
Well, there's so much more in the book in terms of the tidying up of your mind side of it, as well as the tidying up of space and things and stuff part of it. And I want to make sure to drive people to where they can grab that. It's called Tidy Up Your Life, Rethinking How to Organize, Declutter, and Make Space for What Matters Most. Tyler, where can people find out? It's just out, by the way. I want to point people to where they can go that it most will benefit you, whether it's your site or any special preferences.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you asking that. So at thetidydad.com, you can get any information about the book. I do really encourage you, whenever there's a book that's sort of like grabbing your attention or you're super excited, that you reach out to your local bookstore. We all have those local bookstores that are in our neighborhoods, that are in our communities, that are such vitally important places. And so we have a local bookstore in New York that we're partnering with which is Astoria Bookshop. So you could always go there. It's on my website too. But books are available wherever they are sold. And I recorded the audiobook. You have a wonderful, like, booming voice. At first, when my publisher was like, do you want to record the audiobook? I was like, is Morgan Freeman available? And then they were like, no. And I was like, okay, what about Viola Davis? And they were like, no. And I was like, okay, I will do it. But you know, it was cool to be able to record the book in my own voice. And so people, you know, early readers have sort of, or listeners have said, like, it's sort of like a friend is just talking to them. And I think that's cool, that, like, with Tidy Up Your Life, this is not, 10 steps and your life is going to magically be better, because that book doesn't exist. This is like a real dad with a real job, with real vulnerabilities and messes, sort of trying to help readers sort of make sense of their own messes in a way.
Yeah. Well, and again, audiobooks are definitely a preference for a lot of podcast listeners, because they already listen a lot and enjoy listening. Maybe they learn better that way, I have found. So Tyler, it's great. So I will link up to everything in the show notes. Thank you so much for being here. Congratulations again on this journey and the milestones that you're hitting with this. And I can't wait to see, how much more you keep moving forward with this and open door policy. Next time you want to talk, we can dive into even some more cool stuff.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that is another podcast crossed off your listening to-do list. I hope that you've enjoyed this conversation with Tyler Moore. Make sure to go to the show notes at beyondthetodolist.com and just search for Tyler Moore or Tidy Dad, and you will find the link for the book. You can also find them wherever you're listening to this in your podcast player app of choice. And I really hope that you have gotten some insights into your own psyche and your own organizational mind, both in your spaces and in your head, and that you are coming away with takeaways from this episode that you would love to share with somebody that you know needs to hear it. Hit that share button wherever you're at. Do me that favor, share this episode with somebody. Let them know how much you appreciated it. Thank you again for sharing. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next episode.